One of the biggest moves of the NBA trade deadline, in a trade that almost everybody loved, was the LA Lakers adding Mark Williams, a young center who fit perfectly on their team without Anthony Davis and alongside the timeline of Luka Doncic. Well, that trade is now no longer happening. In a shocking turn of events, the Lakers have canceled the Mark Williams trade. So, what exactly happened here? Well, one of the conditions of the Mark Williams trade was that he would pass a physical with the Lakers, because obviously they were excited about what he could become and how much he was going to help their roster. They were willing to give up Dante Connell, a 2031 unprotected first-round pick, and a pick swap to add Mark Williams. But he's played less than 100 NBA games in 2.5 seasons. They're concerned about his injury history, they're concerned about his long-term health, and if you're trading this much in exchange for a guy, you're hoping he's going to be your starting center for at least the next 5 to 7 years. Passing a physical is a typical condition for making NBA trades. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you trade for a guy you know is hurt and don't care if he fails the physical, because you know that he's been recovering from an ACL injury or whatever, and you want to use the contract. But in this scenario, the Lakers obviously wanted to make sure Mark Williams was healthy. So they put him through the physical, and they found some injury issues that they did not like. They failed his physical, and at this point, now that we've passed the trade deadline, the Lakers had two options when they looked at Mark Williams' physical. They could either approve the trade or rescind it. They can't amend it, they can't add extra draft picks, and they can't take back a pick that they would have sent to the Hornets. Those are their only two options, and teams really don't want to do this. They don't want to deal with the awkwardness of Dante Connell coming back to LA and Mark Williams going back to Charlotte. So, the Lakers must have been really concerned about a couple of things they saw on the Mark Williams physical. Now, it was reported that it wasn't related to any kind of back issues, which was a report that was put out and then taken back. But whatever it was, the Lakers are concerned about the long-term health of Mark Williams, and given the amount of assets they were trading in exchange for him, they were not willing to go through with the trade. Now, this isn't unprecedented. Even just earlier in the week, the Caleb Martin-Quentin Grimes trade between Dallas and Philadelphia had an issue with Caleb Martin's physical, and at that point, it was before the deadline, so they still had time to make changes to the deal, and they did. Dallas got some extra draft compensation and then felt comfortable moving forward with the trade, even knowing that Caleb Martin might have been a little bit more hurt than they realized when they made the trade. The difference here for the Lakers was two things. One, they're concerned about his long-term health. It's not that Mark Williams can't play basketball tomorrow. It's about him being their starting center for the next half-decade, and him being the guy they picked to grow alongside Luka at the 5 spot. If he's just never playing, having given up all these assets, obviously that's an issue in the long term. The other problem for the Lakers is that the deadline had passed. There was no opportunity for them to go back to Charlotte and say, hey, we would now like to keep our pick swap or one of our picks, or whatever the case may be. They can't do that. They can't ask for extra compensation from Charlotte to prevent the awkwardness of each of these guys returning to their teams. Like I said, their only two options were to approve the trade or reject the trade, and despite the fact that they definitely didn't want it, they decided to ultimately reject the trade. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't unprecedented. We talked about the Caleb Martin-Quentin Grimes situation earlier in the week. The other times it's happened in terms of big names go back to when Kyrie Irving got traded to Boston. That involved Isaiah Thomas, who was going through a hip injury that he had been dealing with towards the end of the year, was supposed to have surgery, and then didn't and played through it. The Cavs traded for Isaiah Thomas as a core piece of the Kyrie Irving trade, thinking that this guy was an All-NBA caliber guard, potentially at least an All-Star caliber guard, and wasn't going to replace Kyrie. But that was still a team that wanted to win the title, and having Isaiah Thomas was a big part of the deal. They get Isaiah Thomas in, do the physical, and they find some things they don't like. At that point, they were willing and able to go back to Boston and say, hey, we don't want the trade to be rescinded, but we would like some extra draft compensation. I think they got an extra second-round pick or two in the Kyrie Irving deal, and they were able to do that because it was the offseason. The trade deadline had not passed. That's the important piece here. The Lakers made this trade with less than a day to go in the deadline. Then they've been going through all the stuff, all the logistics, the physicals, getting Mark Williams out there, and then they didn't have time to amend the trade. One other scenario that closely resembles this is when Tyson Chandler was supposed to be a member of the Oklahoma City Thunder back in 2009 to 2010. He got traded to OKC, and when he got there, they failed his physical. They had the opportunity to amend the trade, but they didn't, and they rescinded the trade. He ended up not going to OKC, and then 2 years later, he's winning an NBA title with the Mavs as the focal point of their defense in 2011. If you can think about that as a historical comparison, whoever trades for Mark Williams next might end up winning the title. But that is certainly an example of a team getting a big guy. Tyson Chandler was known for having some injury issues throughout his career. OKC failed the physical. He went back, and then he went to Dallas. That's just a huge moment in the history of the NBA, thinking about what Tyson Chandler was to those Mavs teams and thinking about him on those OKC teams. It'd be crazy to actually add him to that. Now, ultimately, if you're the Lakers, this is probably a good thing. Yes, you wanted Mark Williams to be there. Yes, it hurts your postseason possibilities this season. But you don't want to be giving up a significant amount of assets in exchange for a guy that just isn't going to play. If they were that concerned about it, it's clear that they just weren't willing to go through with the amount of assets they traded for a guy that they were just nervous about him continuing to play. This is a huge era for the Lakers where they need to convince Luka that they're serious about winning. They need the Luka era, the beginning of the Luka era, to go really well because, again, he's a 2026 free agent. And that's one of the reasons for the Mark Williams trade, right? They wanted to commit to having a big that Luka was going to be able to play alongside, and ultimately, they just decided it wasn't worth it. It's a good thing that they were able to reject the trade if they were really that concerned, but for this postseason specifically, it's going to be tough for them. I mean, when they made the Mark Williams trade, and you look at some of the lineups they could put out there now without Anthony Davis, you've got Luka, LeBron, you've got Rui, you've got Finney Smith, Austin Reeves, who's been playing really well, then you've got Mark Williams, and then Jackson Hayes as your backup five rather than your starting five. You start to look at this Lakers team and think, man, Luka, LeBron, with a decent roster around them in the playoffs, and an actual legitimate five in Mark Williams, if he's healthy. That's a team that could be dangerous in the postseason. Ultimately, that's not going to happen, and now the Lakers are looking at a situation where Jackson Hayes is going to have to play a bunch. They're going to be looking at the buyout market. They're going to be looking at potential free agent guys, but they're not going to have a starting caliber five on their roster, and in some matchups, that might not be the end of the world. You can play Finney Smith at the five. You can play him alongside Rui, LeBron, Luka, and Austin Reeves and have at least size on the floor, even if you don't have a traditional five. But if you get into a playoff series against a team like Denver, like someone's got to guard Nikola Jokic, and it's not going to be Dorian Finney-Smith. Jackson Hayes is suddenly a really significant piece here for the Lakers, and it's obvious that they didn't want that to be the case. They were going out and looking for a five, and not only did they go out and look for someone they needed for now, but also for the future. They easily could have gone and gotten Clint Capella having injury issues of his own. Nick Claxton is somebody that was out there. There were 5 options out there for them, and they picked a guy in Mark Williams that they felt was going to fit really well along their future timeline. The problem is they also picked a guy that has had injury issues, played less than 100 NBA games, and that's one of the reasons that I didn't love the deal in the first place for the Lakers. I understood the potential upside and the impact of Mark Williams. He's been awesome over the last couple of weeks, but there's also a reason that he's played less than 100 NBA games in his career, and it's clear that the Lakers, as well as other teams around the league, were concerned about his injury issues. And this honestly mostly is a problem for Charlotte, because now they have a guy on their team that, theoretically, a week ago, would have had significant value. They got basically 2 first-round picks if you count Dante Connell as a first-round pick and a pick swap in exchange for Mark Williams, and now everybody around the league is going to be afraid to trade for the guy because whatever the Lakers failed on the physical is still going to be there. Like I said, this is not that Mark Williams can't play in the second half of a back-to-back next week in Portland. That's not what this was. This was long-term concerns that the Lakers have about Mark Williams' health, and presumably, that's going to be an issue for other teams around the league as well. So if you're the Hornets, you went from having a significant asset in Mark Williams, whether he's on the team or elsewhere, to now, all of a sudden, he's probably not worth all that much to these other teams because of the injury concerns. It is a weird scenario. It doesn't happen very often, but this can happen. Like I said, it's not something teams want to happen. They don't want to have to deal with the awkwardness of sending their players back, but in the Lakers' case, they will do it when they're giving up significant assets for a player they don't believe can be healthy in the long term.